Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of Classic Mini DIY. On today's episode, we're going to be rebuilding a gearbox, starting with the disassembly, so stay tuned. Alright everyone, like I said, I am going to be showing you guys how to do a gearbox rebuild. Now, before we get started, couple things. One, this is going to be the amateur's guide to rebuilding your gearbox. I say this because I am not an expert when it comes to gearboxes, gears, all this stuff. So I'm going to be learning this and sharing it with you guys as we go through this whole process. What that means is I might and most likely will make some mistakes here and there. So don't take what I'm showing you to be the word of God or anything when it comes to gearboxes, but I'm going to do my best to share accurate information with you guys. Now, if you haven't heard, I am partnered with 7 Mini Parts doing a huge Christmas and holiday giveaway. We are giving away a performance cylinder head. If you're interested in entering or signing up for that giveaway, head to the link in the description. That is going to be live until December 25th. And then it will be closed and there will be no way to enter it. So get in there. There's lots of different ways to enter as well as daily entry types so you can get as many chances as possible to win this wonderful performance cylinder head that 7 Mini has provided me. Now, for this gearbox rebuild, I'm partnering with both 7 Mini Parts here in North America and Guessworks based out of the UK. Now, 7 Mini Parts, as you guys know, is my part sponsor here in North America. They have tons of awesome parts for a gearbox rebuild and can offer a full gearbox rebuild if you ship them a gearbox. They do all sorts of reconditioning and really awesome stuff. So check them out if that's something you're interested in, if you don't want to kind of tackle this on your own. And then Guessworks is a company that's based out of the UK. It's run by a guy named John Guess, and he offers tons of really fiddly small parts that are really hard to find and can give you all sorts of expert gearbox advice. He is very active on a lot of the big message boards. You might see him popping up here and there, always giving really great feedback. He has partnered with me as well on this episode, and he is providing some really cool bespoke tools as well as, parts and things for this gearbox rebuild. I'll go into that stuff here in a little bit. So no matter where you are in the world, you can find help for your gearbox, rebuilding it, all that stuff at 7 Mini Parts and Guessworks. So check out their websites in the links below. Now, this gearbox is a donor gearbox provided to me by a friend of mine in the UK, Paul Jeffries. He found this gearbox for me, and it is in rough shape. It's definitely really crusty and rusty. I'll show you guys here in a minute. But he sent this over for just the cost of shipping, so huge thank you to him. And he's provided this so that I can show you guys how to rebuild this gearbox. There's a lot of fun in store for this, but before we get started, let me go ahead and show you guys the tools that you might need in order to complete this gearbox rebuild. There are a few small ones that you might not have in your toolbox already. So let's jump over to the bench. Now, a lot of people think, okay, if I have to rebuild my gearbox, I'm gonna need a ton of specialty tools. And you guys can see, looking down here along these tools right now, that that's not actually the case. You don't necessarily need a ton of really special tools. As you can see here, there are some kind of unusual tools, which I'll get into, but the primary ones you're gonna need, ones that are gonna get the most work done out of them, is a good hammer. I would actually recommend a ball peen hammer, a rubber mallet for kind of persuading things that need a little bit lighter touch, a set of good punches, specifically one really long one, some average run-of-the-mill pry bars, a good set of sockets, a socket wrench. Additionally, you can pick up one of these electric impact wrenches. This thing would replace this right here, and it is awesome. I love this thing. All the links to these tools will be in the description, so if you're looking for anything in particular, you'll be able to find it. But then after that, you kind of get into a little bit more of the specialty tools that you probably won't use that much. Now, specifically, you are gonna need a big old socket. You're gonna need a 1.5 inch socket. That's for the pinion nut. And then I always recommend picking up an impact gun like this. Some people call it a zip gun. The general idea is this gives a ton of impact force And if you are picking up a 1.5-inch socket, you do really need to get an impact version of this 1.5-inch socket. And what I mean is this one is a hardened steel version. I don't have a 1.5-inch socket that's hardened steel like this. This is just the regular chrome steel. It's worked out okay for me, but I do always run the risk of breaking that. Now, additionally, you'll see on this left side, if you don't want to spend the money on a big impact wrench like this, you can always pick up a breaker bar. Now right here, we've just got a few picks, a flashlight. The last specialty tool that you will need is a set of circlip removers. So if you're looking at this big set of tools, you're like, oh my God, look at all this stuff. The things that you need the most are this circlip tool, these punches, a good hammer, and probably a breaker bar, as well as your sockets here. The pry bars, the rubber mallet, this stuff, less important, but honestly, if you have all the stuff that you see here, you are gonna be in great shape. So with that, let's dive into the actual gearbox and let me show you guys what we're working with. Now, the gearbox that we're gonna be rebuilding is a rod change gearbox. This is a later model gearbox, one that you might find in probably a later car. Now, the gearbox that we're gonna be rebuilding was a donor from a good friend of mine in the UK, Paul Jeffries. He helped me source this and donated this gearbox for simply the cost of shipping. And as you can see, it's in rough shape. It's gonna need a little bit of work. But what we're looking at is a rod change gearbox with pot joint differential outputs and a standard differential in it. Now, this is a 4-speed gearbox. It has all stock parts from what I can see. So this is going to be a really good example of what your gearbox might look like if you have a rod change gearbox. Now, there is another type of gearbox, a remote change gearbox, but in this video and this series, we are not going to be covering that type of gearbox. All right, so now that you've had a good look at the outside and kind of what we're working with here, let's go ahead and dive into taking this apart. I'm pretty excited. I don't know about you guys. Now, the first thing that we're gonna do, first thing before anything else, is we're gonna need to take the Speedo housing off so that we can get to all the bolts that are on the inside here. That'll give us access to the large nut that holds on your main shaft. And then what we'll do is we'll flip this around and I will show you guys the other side where we'll have to take off a few other things. Now, in my case, you can see this is rusty and it's actually missing a large portion of the bolts. So we are definitely gonna have to replace the bolts on these moving forward, but that's definitely for the reassembly phase. For right now, let's go ahead and pick off these nuts here, and then what we can do is slowly work this housing off. Now, quick tip, when you're taking the Speedo housing off, make sure that you do not hammer from the inside, as you do run the risk of popping a hole in this. This is aluminum and it's not, you know, crazy strong like steel. So just take your time, give it a little tap, wiggle, wiggle, you know, take your time. You are not gonna wanna hammer around the edges of this, as what can happen is you can mar the aluminum here and then it won't get a good seal later on. So there's a lot of rules around this. It seems like there really aren't, but just take your time. Now, first thing I'm gonna be doing is pulling out this gear here. This is your Speedo drive gear. As you can see, I'm coming in from the top of the gearbox here to get down to this post, and this is just gonna slide out of here. And in my case, it's a little tight because it's so rusty, but set that off to the side. And then next we'll take off this little Speedo cover here. Let's see if I can get that off with my hands. All right, that'll come out. As you can see, this is that spline that is driving your speedometer cable, which gets attached right here and is driven by that whole system there. So now, next up, we're gonna take this last bolt out because there are literally no other bolts on this thing. Now, I know I just told you guys not to do what basically I just did, but keep in mind this is a very, very skinny screwdriver, and I'm very careful not to mar any of the sides here. But basically, you're just gonna wanna slowly work this cover off. It really likes to stick on there. Just over the years, this thing doesn't come off very frequently, and it holds on tight. So, and there we have it. So you can see we've got all the old gasket material here. You don't have to take a whole lot of time to get that off right now because this is all gonna go to the machine shop to get really properly cleaned. So I'm gonna set that off to the side as well. And now we have good access to the actual nut on the side here. Now, before we get started on this, because in my case, it might actually be that this main shaft is seized, we shall see. But what you normally have to do is engage some gears in order to keep the main shaft from spinning so that you can whack this little nut off in here. Now, the next thing that we're gonna need to take off and get disassembled is our diff. And the reason we need to take that apart is so that we can get our actual gearing locked into place so you can engage both the second gear and fourth gear. If I remember correctly, I might have that mixed up. But it's so that we can engage both of those gears at the same time, which will lock up the assembly and allow us to disconnect the bolt that's inside here. So it's pretty straightforward taking this stuff apart. Realistically, all you gotta do is knock back these lock tabs and remove the bolts. Now, like I said before, what we're looking at here is the differential, and this differential has output shafts that are for pot joints. And the pot joint, or also called a continuous velocity, a CV joint, is mounted on here, and that's what actually drives your drive shafts and moves your car forward. Now, in order to get these off, it's just a couple of bolts, so I'll whack those off and then I'll show you guys what the diff looks like with more detail. All right, and so now that we have all the bolts off of here, we can pry these covers off. Now, you do want to be careful. They do break. There are things that can happen to these. You know, these things will snap. So just take your time. Don't rush it. Disassembly at this stage is it's very delicate and you don't want to break things. This one is actually already chipped right at the top here, so I might even need a new cover here for this differential cover. I say be easy with it, but obviously that just came off really, really easy. So as you can see, one is out. We have our differential showing here, and then let's see if I can get this other one off just as easily. Differential cover number 2. These look like the original gaskets. They do not look very new at all. They're very skinny. So we'll set those off to the side. And now we have access to our diff on each side, which is pretty cool. So let me flip this up and we can start taking a look from the top down. It's gonna make it a lot easier to see. All right, and so as you can see, there are some nuts that are missing on this as well, but we are gonna start taking off this cover here. There are 4 main bolts that hold this on. These are kind of like the primary ones that set the preload on these bearings here, which is very important. I'm gonna go into that when we start reassembling this. But on the right side here, there is actually a small spring. This is, I think this is called your detent spring. So you've got your spring here, you're gonna set that off to the side, and we're also going to get a small ball out of there, which in my case, which I would recommend getting a little magnet. As you can see here, this is just a little ball that sits down on the inside of that spring. Set those off to the side. You are going to want to keep those, you don't want to lose them, and that is pretty much that on that side. And now after that, all we're going to do is knock down these lock tabs and kind of unbolt this thing here and get this disconnected. So let's do that. Now with a rebuild like this, you are gonna wanna hold on to as many parts as you can. A lot of this stuff you can get replacements for though, so specifically the nuts and bolts, I always replace the hardware on a build when I'm doing something like this because there's really just no reason not to be completely frank. You can get nice grade 8 bolts and nuts and make sure everything, you know, is brand new when it goes back on. But at this point, what we're gonna do is take this cover off. Now, just like with the Speedo housing, you're gonna wanna be nice with this. You're not gonna wanna like hammer the hell out of it. You're not gonna wanna pry it too much. You're just gonna wanna try and work it off as best you can and take this off here without damaging any of the differential if you're planning on reusing it. In the case of this diff though, I'm probably not gonna be reusing it simply because I want to replace it with a cross pin differential, which I'll talk about once we get to that point there. So, so now I'm gonna just kind of start working this off and giving it a tap here and there and see if we can get it off. All right, and so that is our diff cover off. I'm gonna set that off to the side along with our Speedo housing. And now we have a good look at this differential. Now, this is your final drive gear right here. This is what appears to be one of the larger final drive gears that you can get. And you've got your bearings here. You can see there are shims that came off of the side here. This is used to set the float on the end of your output covers. Again, I will show you more about this when we get into it later on. But go ahead and keep those shims. There are sets that you can pick up for them, but in this case, we want to keep those just in case we want to use them again. So now we have a good look at our diff, and we can also see the damage to the diff. So let's take this out. And as you can see, this differential had a bit of a failure here. This is not supposed to stick out like that. If we rotate it around, you can see the pin has almost completely like shifted its way out of there, and boom, poking out on this end. And that's not ideal, and it's one of the reasons that these single pin diffs are just not great. They are not strong. They're not strong like a cross pin differential is, and often things like this happen. I'm gonna talk a lot about final drive gears when we're putting this stuff together, about which one you might want in your car, but for right now, we're gonna set this off and keep disassembling. Now, before we flip this back over and before we get into kind of disengaging and re-engaging and all the engagings that we need to do, note that we have to take this gear selector, which is this rod right here. This is actually what's running to your gear lever. And so when you turn your gear lever like this or like this is getting pulled in and out and rotating left and right, and it's helping to select the gears on your main shaft. And using these gear selectors right here, it's using it to push and pull those into the correct position. Now, in order to engage two gears at the exact same time, we actually have to disengage this lever here. And the way that's done is, you can see we've got some movement in the inside there, and we're gonna go ahead and disengage that completely. And you can see here, it's kind of hard to see. I'm doing my best to show you. This is the actual selector, and you're gonna wanna move it all the way to the left so it's out of the way and it can't engage anything. And with that, you'll be able to kind of pull this all out here so you can see it and get it out of the way. And that's pretty cool. So now that that's out of the way, we are gonna be able to actually manually engage two gears at the same time to lock this in place and keep it from spinning when we don't want it to. So I'm gonna set this down and let's move back to the top side. Now this part, all we have to do is engage two gears at the exact same time. Specifically, we need to move the gear selector on the left side over onto the teeth on the left side of that gear selector. Note that this back here is where our differential was, and then we're gonna need to move the right gear selector over the small gears on the right. Now, you might also have to move your small reverse gear, which is down here. You might need to move that over to the right as far as it can go, and using a little bit of oomph, you should be able to get that pushed over. So once that is out of the way, all you do is take your hands, slide this one out like so, and you do the exact same thing on this one, which sometimes can be a little bit difficult. There we go. That one slid right over there with a little bit of persuasion by the pry bars. So now this whole gear system, this whole main shaft right here is locked into place, which means it can't go anywhere. So now we should be able to get this nut off the end here. Now the next thing that we're gonna be doing here is taking our big impact driver here, and we're gonna see if we can ratchet this off. This is a big nut, and it's held on with 150 foot-pounds of torque. And if it's never been taken off, this thing can be a real bastard to get off. So fair warning, but let's go ahead and give this a shot. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't want to come off. And I have also tried my breaker bar. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna spray a little bit of silicone lubricant on it. I'm gonna get some penetrant in there, and then hopefully we can get it off when it's not so late out and I won't be bothering the neighbors. So let's spray some lubricant on there and see if we can let this sit overnight. All right, and so with that, we'll let it sit overnight and we'll come back and see if we can get it off. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I have a confession to make. I did not DIY the removal of this nut, nor did I DIY the removal of the nut on this other side. When I just left you a moment ago, I guess a couple seconds for you, this was not coming off, and I soaked it and soaked it and soaked it and tried and tried and tried, but this thing would just not come off. I tried a breaker bar, I tried my impact wrench, and like nothing was bringing this off. So I brought it to a local shop and I had them help me take this off. So sometimes it is okay to ask for a little bit of help on these kinds of things. The next thing we'll be doing after taking that big nut off is taking off all these small nuts. Now, there's 4 of them around here, and some gearboxes only have 3 of these on there. These things had a tendency to break, from what I understand, and to prevent that from happening, I think a lot of people actually leave out this top bolt. I don't fully remember. Personally, I feel like they should all go there, but I'm definitely not a gearbox expert. So I'm gonna knock back these lock tabs here, and then we will go ahead and whack those off. All right, so once you take this off, you'll probably see a few things fell out here. One thing I went ahead and took off was the pinion gear here. This is the gear that engages with your differential. This one I went ahead and just slid right off. Then you've got your retainer here. This retains everything. I know, crazy. And as you can see, it has 4 bolt holes. We'll set that off to the side. Go ahead and keep all of those bolts together. We're gonna try and reuse those. Now, the next thing that we have here is a shim. This shim is used to set the float down here and make sure everything's set properly. I'm gonna go into that in more detail once we get to that part of the build. But again, set this off to the side. We might be able to reuse it. If not, we might need to get one that fits and sets that float better. Now finally, down here, there is a small little tab. This holds the lay shaft and the lay gear in place, as well as a reverse gear shaft right here. So this slides right out. Keep this, it's very important. And then with that, all of these shafts should be able to should move relatively freely. Now, next up, we have our lay shaft. Now, if you have a stock gearbox in a stock oil pickup, you might remember I took this off just a little bit ago. It would be sitting right here down in the oil screen, and that's how it picks up oil from the right side of your gearbox. Now this has some bolts right on the back here that come out. In my case, they were already gone, so I can go ahead and set that off to the side. Now the screen is still sitting down there, which we can't get to until we get this lay gear out. Now, in order to get that out, we disconnected the pinion gear and everything on this side. And I added just a little bit of lubrication so that we can go ahead and push the whole lay shaft out of the lay gear out to the right. Note that this side is the front side of your gearbox. So we take our hand, push that, and if it gets a little tight, you might need to use a long punch or some sort of guide. In my case, I'm gonna be using a very long punch, and I'm just gonna tap it nicely. It doesn't have to, you shouldn't need a ton of force to get this thing out. And then out of the right side of your gearbox comes your lay shaft, and the shaft holds your lay gear. And in this case, it actually doesn't look too bad. It's in pretty good shape. That said, I personally always replace this when it's out because, I mean, how many times do you want to tear down your gearbox, realistically? And it just seems kind of like a no-brainer. Now, there are a few different lay shafts based on the gearbox you have, so just take note of the one you have, take note of what it looks like. I'm going to go into this when we're rebuilding it so you have an idea what you're looking for on your gearbox, so I'm going to set that off to the side. So in order for all the gears to move again, we do have to disengage the 2 gears here, or at least one of them, but I'm going to go ahead and disengage both. And then once you disengage those, you should be able to roll this out. In my case, my oil screen is getting a little bit in the way, so I'm gonna disconnect these bolts real quick, kind of push it back, and then it should allow this gear to clear up at the top side. And then we'll be able to roll the whole Laygear out. All right, and like I said, with that oil screen loose, you should be able to roll this out of there, at least pretty good. As you can see, came right up to the top, and you can lift that out. Take note, there are needle rollers in here. These are pretty straightforward. They are little rollers that look like needles, and there is one on each side. In my case, the other one fell out and down into the bottom there. So go ahead and grab those. Those are good things to go ahead and replace when you have this out. And then the next things we're gonna take off here, there is some thrust washers. Now there's a thrust washer that sits here, and then a thrust washer that sits on the other side, right in here. Now, obviously one is larger than the other. Keep these. You might be able to reuse these if the end float is correct. If not, you'll have to buy one to take up the slack that's in between the Laygear and the thrust washer. But again, that's a reassembly thing that we'll talk about later. Now, don't forget, you want to go ahead and take this oil screen out, and you can see here, this one actually is in okay shape. There's not a lot of grossness in it. There is a little like buildup at the bottom, but I think that's just from sitting. So that'll go off to the side. We are not going to be reusing this, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So now the next thing that we're going to do is take out our reverse gear, which is this little teeny gear down here. Now, this is on a shaft, just like your lay shaft was, running through here. And there's a small hole right down here that you should be able to actually slide a punch through, and then you can kind of tap that all the way out. So I'm gonna go ahead and tap that sucker out of there. All right, and so after driving that rod all the way out, you're gonna be able to get this reverse gear out, as you can see, and this we definitely wanna hold on to if you don't have a replacement. However, I do have a replacement set of gears that's gonna be going in here. So for right now, that's out of the way, and we can actually drive this post back the other direction so that it comes out the rest of the way. And there we have it, the rod for our reverse gear. This thing is really gummed up and crusty. It was really difficult to get out, mostly because there's a lot of surface rust, and the clearances down there are very, very small. So we did end up getting it out. Go ahead and set this off to the side. We'll see if we can get this polished or cleaned up, although it might be worthwhile to just go ahead and replace this. All right, so now that we have all that other stuff apart, it's finally time to get into the main shaft and taking this apart. Now this part is where you're gonna need that special tool, the circlip tool, and you can see there are two little holes right here, and you're gonna squeeze that, and that is gonna be how you get that, and that's gonna be how you get this little circlip out. As you can see, it does take a little bit of force, and this thing likes to fall, and this thing does sometimes like to get stuck. So in situations like this where you've got this really, really caked in rust, sometimes it does take a little bit of effort, so get ready. Now, as you can see, I've got it out here, and that was quite difficult. Now, this is probably something that we can go ahead and reuse. So I'm gonna keep this off to the side here. I don't wanna lose that. All right, so now that we have that circle clip off, we should be able to push this last gear as well as this bearing out that direction. Now, in most cases, this might be a little bit difficult, especially if it's really rusty like this one is. I did oil it up a lot, and what I will do is I'm gonna put you guys on the front side of the gearbox while I do this, and I'm gonna hammer this away, but the general idea is that you wanna hammer around the bearing face. You don't wanna damage it, just in case you do wanna reuse this. In my case, I don't really care that much if it's damaged because I am gonna be replacing it. All right, and so with that, we have the gear out of here. This bearing is basically completely seized, but you can see we've got the last gear. I am hoping to disassemble this and reuse it, which I'll go into in the next episode, but set that off to the side and we should be able to get the remaining portion of your main gear out. All right, so this next part is kind of fiddly. You're gonna wanna be extra careful because the bearing inside here is very expensive. This specific bearing is a double roller bearing, if I remember correctly, so you're gonna wanna take your time on this. This is something that you don't wanna damage because you probably want to reuse it. So as you can see, I've got my punch here. I'm gonna put this right on the end and I'm gonna give this a couple taps. All right, and so what you'll see is slowly happening here is there's space getting built up on the end of the main gear here. Now, I do want to keep pushing this out. I want to get as much space as I can down in here in this roller bearing because I do want to push the roller bearing, the bearing that's inside here, out this direction. Now, at this point, we've reached kind of the max threshold as far as it'll go. And the reason it won't go anymore is because the shift fork down here is actually gonna prevent it from going any farther. The synchro right here, it all fits together and it's gonna prevent it from going farther because at this point, this right here is where it would be if it was engaged on that end gear. Now at this point, this is where we're gonna use one of those bespoke tools that I was talking to you guys about from Guessworks. And that tool actually fits right down in between these gears so that you can go ahead and hammer the other end of this shaft, and it's gonna push that bearing, that double roller bearing, out this direction. So let me get that tool, I'll show you what I'm talking about. Now basically the small piece, the tool that I'm talking about that Guessworks sent over for me is basically a small piece of aluminum, and this goes right down inside the space here. It'll allow you to hammer on this end over here, that direction, and it'll push the double roller bearing out here. So let's go ahead and give this a little tap and see how well this thing works. All right, and so with that spacer in there now, one thing I did miss is this gear. I'm not really sure what this gear is called, but it comes out of this side from inside this synchronizer thing here. And now we should be able to bang from this end all the way out. So let's go ahead and start doing that. All right, so main shaft's out. Pretty cool stuff. But I think that's general idea is you gotta take those selectors off, you gotta take off that one gear, and then you should be able to hammer it all the way down. Now, one thing I did end up using was a fancy official punch tool here on the end of the main shaft so I could hammer it all the way through. So for the last part, you need to punch out this little teeny roll pin right here. And I don't know where my smaller punch went, so I'm gonna have to improvise and use like a small screwdriver. Hopefully this will work for us. So here we have that shaft with the hole here that we pushed that roll pin out of. The roll pin should be down here along with this other shift fork. Let's go ahead and lift that out of there. That is also very crusty. And now all we're left with in this box is obviously our shift selector. So the way that this works, and you can kind of see what's happening when you're shifting gears, is your rod is going in and out. So right here, we would be engaging and disengaging reverse. If I remember correctly, please correct me in the comments if I'm getting any of this wrong. Then you rotate it up and it's gonna select first or second, there and there. And then here, last one, third and fourth, something like that. You can see there's all sorts of fun leaves and stuff in here. The last thing that we need to get out of here are these gear selectors right here. And it's pretty simple. This is a 9/16 bolt, so I'm gonna go ahead and get my socket wrench and pull that off. And there you have it. All of our gear selector forks are off. Set these off to the side, and then this post right here. Now, my understanding is that this is just hammered out the bottom. It's like pressed in or something. I'm gonna go ahead and hammer it out, and hopefully I'm not doing something wrong here. But apparently that is a common place for that to leak, I guess. That's what I've heard. I really am not sure, so please, comment section if anyone has any information about this, if I'm doing this right, or if I'm damaging it now by taking it out this way, let me know. And here you can see it coming off of the bottom here, and I'm just gonna slowly work it off with my pry bar. We now have a completely stripped gearbox. So let's wrap this up because this is about as much as I can handle for one day's worth of work. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps this episode up. So we got a ton of work done on this gearbox. I want to say a huge thank you to 7 Mini Parts and Guessworks for sponsoring this episode, sending me some cool tools, and lots of parts are coming from 7 Mini Parts and Guessworks over the next couple weeks while I rebuild this gearbox for you guys. So aside from that, what questions do you have? Are there things that I didn't dive into here that you would like to hear more about? Or are there things that you saw that I did incorrectly? Let me know. If there are comments that outline some really good tips, I'll pin those to the top of the page, or I'll make a post that kind of summarizes all of those and pin that up to the top of the page, because I think YouTube only lets me pin one comment at a time. So aside from that, I think the next episode will take apart the main shaft. I'll show you guys all the different gears there after I learn them. And I'll bring this to the part shop, let them really get this nice and clean. Either blast it, do something with it. I don't know how they're gonna clean it, but it's gonna look really good when it's done. And then we can also assess the state of the gears that came out and what we'll need to replace. All the kind of bits and bobs, and get our parts ordered from Guessworks and 7 Mini Parts. So until next time, thank you so much for watching, and enjoy those minis and motor on.